This is the 11th Facing Hard Questions session. As you might recall from reading the prompt, this is a session that is reflecting on texts, particularly in the Older Testament, that curse enemies or celebrate the impending destruction of enemies or ask God to take vengeance on enemies. And perhaps we should start by saying that for all Christians, hopefully, but particularly for Mennonites, Jesus's teachings on enemy love and forgiveness are pretty central to what it means to be a follower of Christ. In Luke 6, Jesus says, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who mistreat you. So a very radical stance on how God's people ought to treat even those who persecute them. And yet, in the Older Testament, we have quite a few passages that don't seem to take that approach. And I think what triggered me from bringing this up now is that this week I had us read from the book of Nahum because it relates to this material that we're reading about in Kings. And Nahum for me is probably the most difficult book in the Bible to accept as authoritative because it is a book that not only calls for vengeance against enemies, but does so in particularly graphic and disturbing ways. And there's not a lot of other stuff in Nahum to really balance it out. So despite me writing a reflection in the newsletter about it and including it in my sermon today, this is really me therapeutically making an effort to see the value in a book that is hard for me to acknowledge. So I thought maybe I'd just start by reading a few different passages from parts in the Bible that talk about this and then opening it up for your reflection. And maybe I should offer a kind of trigger warning here that some of these, particularly one from Nahum, are somewhat graphic and even invoke a kind of sexual violence that might be difficult for people to hear. So I don't read these with any glee, but since this is facing hard questions, since the purpose of these sessions is to look at these passages, which are the hardest for many of us to embrace, I think this is an appropriate place to talk about it. So starting with near the introduction of Nahum, after the introductory verse where we're told who Nahum is and that, to whom he's preaching, verses 2 and 3 say, a jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and rages against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. So that gives you a good sense of what's to come in the book of Nahum. It's a book about God taking vengeance on enemies, and particularly one enemy. Nineveh is the stated target of the book, and Nineveh, as some of you might recall, was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. But I want to go and read another passage from later in Nahum that I just cringe every time I see it. It says, here again, the Lord is speaking to Nineveh. I am against you, says the Lord of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will let nations look on your nakedness and kingdoms on your shame. It's just kind of an image that involves a male sexually humiliating a female to shame her, which is hard. I want to note that Nahum's not the only book that has these kinds of issues, although that might be, for me, the verse that is the hardest to swallow. But from the book of Obadiah, which we'll encounter later in the series, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So here's this kind of celebration of the total annihilation, genocide, I don't know how you want to call it, of the house of Esau, which is how the biblical writers referred to the Edomites, the people of Edom, who were understood to be descended from Jacob's brother Esau. There are actually passages like this in many of the prophets, including the ones that we think of as peaceful prophets, like Isaiah and Micah. But Nahum and Obadiah are particularly hard because that's really all that they talk about. In fact, I mentioned this, I think I mentioned this in the reflection, unless I cut it out, but they are the only two books in the Old Testament that the lectionary doesn't even mention once. Apparently the lectionary compilers couldn't find a verse in Nahum or Obadiah that they felt good enough about to include in the daily readings over a period of 3 years. And then the last set that I want to discuss are a type of psalm called the imprecatory psalms. If some of you were in the Psalms class from before, this might be familiar. But the psalms are challenging in a different way because they are often held up as a model for how we should pray and how we should, it's not just we're listening to somebody else's communication with God, but this is kind of a devotional practice for many people. And several of the Psalms pray that God will in some way harm or destroy the psalmist's enemies. So kind of an example from Psalm 69, jumping around a little bit, but it's between verses 19 and 28. You know the insults I receive, and my shame and dishonor. My foes are all known to you, God. Let their table be a trap for them, a snare for their allies. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your burning anger overtake them. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. Ultimately, a prayer for their enemies' deaths. And then I feel compelled to share, I want to get all the worst ones out so that there's no more surprises waiting behind the corner for you. But in my mind, out of all of the imprecatory psalms, the one that is the hardest, the one that's perhaps the most graphic, is one that is comes from Psalm 137, and is directed toward the Babylonians, who ultimately destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And it says, O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. So we've got an image of violence against children there. That's a lot. That's hard. Those are hard passages to read. So I just want to start by giving you all an opportunity to respond emotionally or intellectually. Like, how does it affect you to read these kinds of passages in our scriptures? What do you do with them? Have you been aware of them? Tell me, what's your response to having us reflect, even having me read these right now?
I think it was in a class on the Psalms that Jay made a comment that I found very helpful. We were talking about Psalm 137. And he saw it as if I'm remembering correctly, as sort of the cry of a person who's been traumatized, or a people who've been traumatized. You know, as you said, the temple's been destroyed. The people of Judah have been deported to Babylon, and they're expressing their rage, their desire for vengeance, their pain. Happy is he who repays you for what you've done to us. You know, we've been mistreated. We've been yanked out of our homes and hauled off to a place we don't know. Some of us surely died along the way. And boy, would we like to give them back what they just gave to us. And I think for us who have lived our lives in peacetime, not in a time of war, and who cannot quite get our heads into what this would be like, it just seems over the top. But I think for people who have been through those kinds of traumatic experiences, there's more of a sense of identification with that. My mother, who lived through World War II, we were evacuated to southern France twice, depending on where the front was going. She would say, when people would talk about pacifism and I would never do this and I would never do that, she would say, you don't know what you would do if you were in that situation. So I look at these, you know, as a cry of anguish and of anger, not as a, certainly not as something that is teaching us how we should respond. There's not a should in here. And also not, I mean, even the ones in the prophets are more, it's like the prophets are expressing the trauma of the people. And it's very ugly. But we should know, if we've been paying attention over the last decade, you know, refugees coming out of Syria and children drowning in the ocean trying to get to freedom, and refugees from Africa coming up trying to get to Italy and being turned away, and people drowning, and, you know, immigration kids on our southern border in cages and dying because of poor medical care, and on and on and on. We should be able to understand where that anger comes from, I guess. Said no.
And anger can result in hyperbole, certainly. When I was a kid, if somebody was particularly angry with somebody else, I'm going to kill you. And we don't say that. I mean, kids don't say that much anymore, I don't think, because we've trained them to not. But nobody actually thought they were going to commit murder. That was just a way of just really making sure it was clear you were angry.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have reactions to this? Those are both very helpful comments, I think.
I used to preach a lot from the lectionary. So I was with congregations that followed the lectionary. And if my recollection is correct, you know, the lectionary, the good thing or the advantage of it, or the contribution it makes, is that it, you know, gives you the opportunity to get through broad representation of the Bible over 3 years. Mm-hmm. And every week there's a reading from the Old Testament, or First Testament, Second Testament, and then something maybe from one of the epistles, and there's always a psalm or a proverb along with it. So But my recollection is that whenever these difficult scriptures came up, particularly like in the Psalms, they would get cut off right at the point where it switched from all this beautiful language of praise and, you know, glory and all this, and then like, okay, and then wipe out my enemies, you know, destroy them, you know, and all this kind of thing. I'm not quoting very well, but, and it's interesting too, I think the way that a lot of the Psalms are, those kinds of lines, verses are towards the end. So it's kind of easy to kind of lop them off, you know, and just sort of stop the reading at that point. And I think the same thing was maybe true of some of the pericopes or passages that were selected. So it in a way, it highlighted the better parts of our, you know, the better nature angels of our whatever scriptures or texts, and found a way to omit the ones that we found uncomfortable. And, you know, so I guess we're kind of left with, do we want to preach those scriptures or read those scriptures that we find so reprehensible now, because they may be parts of our tradition that are just horrifying to us. But to the point that Martha was just making, or Jay or whoever, you know, I think they're just such human, divinely inspired human documents. And for whatever reason, I think the Holy Spirit doesn't want us to run away from whatever passions we might be feeling, or anger, or brutal feelings, because ultimately we know the message that embraces all of them is that God doesn't want that activity, that that's not God's way. But it can be confusing, but I think it does acknowledge those realities and gives us a way to put them out there to God and trust that God can handle it. And that if we, like, I like what we do, or what you do, Brian, is, you know, to put them out there and then we grapple with it. What does this mean for us? What is God doing with this? You know, if this is our holy text, then how does it become transformed into how God wants to use it among us now? So that's my thinking.
And I'll just confess that not only the lectionary, but I also, when selecting scripture passage, will often cut it off right before it gets to the particularly trouble.
I've done that too, regardless of whether I'm using lectionary.
Right. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, yeah. As I work with offenders and I reflect on humanness, we haven't, the human experience hasn't changed since Jesus's day. I mean, we can still do horrendous things to people. And I guess I'm appreciating the Bible in terms of it does express the whole human emotional continuum. And I know I haven't studied it specifically, but it's here in front of us, and we still have to contend with that whole human emotional experience. And because the Psalms allow us to express that pain and anger and get them, God. I think we need that as well, so that when we're praying, we can also express those deep, deep feelings of, oh, this is terrible. This is not what right. So yeah, peace is hard to find sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. So feel free to keep jumping in with comments wherever we go. But as I was trying to look at how different Christians approach these passages, because I would say even most even Christians who aren't pacifists have trouble with passages that talk about bashing babies against rocks, right? Like this is something that most Christians struggle with. I kind of observed three types of ways that people make sense of this. One of them is what I would call a psychological view, which is what in one way or another most of you have been expressing, that like these passages give particularly oppressed people a way of expressing and maybe even constructively dealing with their feelings of vengeance and just deep anger over the things that have happened to them. But I want to, and it's worth reflecting on how well that works or not in a minute. But I want to kind of bring up a couple of other options too. There's what some folks would maybe call, you might call a dispensational view, and that's the idea that at different times in the history of the people of God, different approaches or responses are appropriate or inappropriate. And so some people would suggest that just that it was appropriate for the people of Israel to fight to defend their land and their territory at that time, but it's not appropriate for Christians to fight in the same way today. And likewise, it's appropriate for them to call down vengeance on their enemies. But Jesus made that inappropriate for us. I'd say that this is probably closer to what the original Mennonites thought than the kind of psychological interpretations that we modern people use about how these passages might be helpful for healing. So I'm just going to put that out there. And then the other point that I think is a little more interesting, though I'm not necessarily comfortable with it, is this suggestion that these curses are actually consistent with the rest of the Bible. That there is a suggestion throughout all of Scripture that those who sin, those who do evil, will experience the wrath of God, that they'll experience justice in some way or another. And this is meant to be a point of comfort. And while it's usually kind of a minor note, in these passages, it's lifted up as a major note, right? And one particularly interesting way to think about this, in my opinion, is the way that Nahum and Jonah, which, as I mentioned in the reflection, I see as kind of paired together in the scriptures, how they both work with a very important phrase from Exodus. Back in Exodus 34, there's this famous phrase that says, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty. Right? This is a description of God as a loving God, as a God who forgives, but it also has this line about not letting the guilty get away with it. And Nahum seems to be making reference to this passage, but highlighting that no means clearing the guilty part, when at the beginning of his book, he says, a jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power, and will by no means clear the guilty, right? Like, so he's wanting to highlight this. By contrast, a book like Jonah highlights the other part of it. And in fact, Jonah's mad about it, right? So when God forgives the Ninevites in the book of Jonah, Jonah says, oh Lord, is this not what I said while I was in my own country? For I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, ready to relent from punishing. So it's not necessarily, this person would argue, that these contradict each other. It's that these two emphases are always there. But in books like Nahum and Obadiah, they come out more explicitly. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I just want to put these, so there's kind of this psychological approach of thinking about this as a way of working with the experience of trauma, of being harmed in a deep way, and of responding to it as kind of just a dispensational approach. This might have been valid for people at that time in history, but it's not for us. Or that this is just highlighting a part of the gospel that we tend to downplay. What do you think? Do any of those jump out to you? Do any of those trouble you? Those kinds of ways of responding to this passage? It looks like you might be saying something, Joyce, but I still can't hear you.
Okay, how about this?
Got better, yes.
I thought I unmuted, but I muted. I don't know if I totally understand the dispensationalism thing, but somewhere along the line as growing up, I remember some guest preacher or something like that who was explaining it all, and it seemed to me to include saying that what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount and all of that no longer applies to today.
Right, that's the danger of the dispensational. You can use it the other way too, but you're right. I mean, that's yes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just to affirm that.
I just wanted to clarify that can be part of that, or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it comes from. I want to say could be Irenaeus originally. Some early church figure looked through at the Bible as a series of covenants that God makes with people. A covenant with Noah, a covenant with Moses, a covenant with David, a covenant with Jesus, and argues that the rules are a little bit different in each of these. The expectations are renegotiated in each of these covenants. They represent different dispensations of what God expects from us at this time. And so that leaves a whole lot of wiggle room for people to dismiss biblical instructions, including the Sermon on the Mount, because they could say, well, that just applied to that particular dispensation. But it has been an influential view over the course of Christian history.
But don't we, in some ways, really agree with these passages? After all, we say hell is, if you don't get it in this life, you're going to get it in the one to come. So are we any different?
Right, that would be a way of affirming kind of that third view, that this is implicitly a part of our message even today. Then that dovetails into a whole different discussion about how we all understand hell, which we already had a quarter-long class about. But I think to deny that there's some, however you define it, there's some discussion of hell or negative consequences for those who do evil. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid thing to bring up, at least.
I don't want to get off the question that you asked, but I just wanted a little clarification from the history of it, if you might, Brian. But before I say that, I just want to comment that the timing of the readings with Nahum and Jonah was very timely, because tomorrow is Yom Kippur, and actually that whole book of Jonah is read as the last during the last Torah service. They have Torah service a couple of times where they bring out the Torah, they read from the Torah, and then in the Jewish synagogue, that is, and then they have another portion that's read after that, and called the Haftarah, and normally from the prophets, and that whole Jonah story is the very last story that they hear on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
That's
It's really
very interesting. I didn't know that when I was working on the schedule. So
well, yeah, but
yeah.
So I just thought I'd point that out. But my question is just what actually, I mean, I never really questioned it, reading in Jonah, it's a story about how devastated he is, that God's actually going to forgive them after all this, but in the end, God doesn't forgive us here. I mean, it's like Nahum says, they get destroyed and they're not forgiven. So what happens there in the history? Is there like just a brief interval when Nineveh doesn't go down like they think, kind of like the way it happened with Jerusalem not getting destroyed when Judah was conquered? Or, I mean, can you explain how did God forgive Nineveh when it ultimately, they get conquered anyway?
Fair question. So Jonah is one of the hardest books is one of the hardest prophetic books, especially to actually attach a real date to. Amos and Hosea and Nahum can be connected to kind of specific periods of time, at least generally. In Nahum, for example, there's a reference to a historical event in which Assyria conquers Thebes and destroys the city of Thebes, and so people can kind of use that as a reference point. Jonah is not, and so some even speculate, did Jonah really happen? Is this just something that a tale that was made up? And I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but I would say I have a hard time placing it historically. I think of it more as thematically being a balance. So I have seen more conservative folks who do try to attach a date to Jonah, and they'll put it much earlier. Sometimes they'll put it even before the Assyrians came into Israel in the first place, that Jonah was already aware of them as this violent empire, and he didn't want God to do anything with them for that end. But anyway, for me, that's a fair question. That is one of the challenges, is it's hard to know where exactly to put Jonah in terms of a timeline. And so I think of it as being more of a thematic balance to Nahum than like a historical answer to Nahum, if that makes sense.
Sure. Thanks.
But the role of the timing question is what? That maybe those people at the time that Jonah was there were forgiven, but then Nineveh was destroyed at a later time, so it's different people? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't know if you were asking that to me or to Sabrina, but I mean, that's some people speculate that, that it just talks about the king of Nineveh. It doesn't give a name to who the king of Nineveh is, and so you could suggest that it was a very early king, but right. I mean, ultimately, Nineveh was conquered and destroyed. So. So yes, I think if you were going to put it in a chronology historically, then that's how you'd have to do it. You'd have to say at an earlier time the people of Nineveh repented, but then a later series of Ninevites did not repent, and so ultimately they were punished for what happened.
I mean, the role of time is complicated. We talk about the United States today, and there was a United States 100 years ago, and we're not the same people as were here 100 years ago, except very few people, right, Joanne? Who make it 100 years. But, so we talk about the entity of Assyria, but it isn't necessarily the same people at every point in Assyria's history. And the same obviously is true of of Israel and of Judah. It's not the same people all the way through. So,
Yeah.
you know, some people died and some people made it.
Right.
If you think about the deportation, not everybody made it all the way to Babylon, and certainly not everybody came back. And yet we talk about restoration, even though a large Jewish community persisted in Babylon for many, many years, hundreds of years.
Right. And Assyria especially is a very, very old history of, there was the old empire of Assyria, which existed more than 1,000 years before this particular empire of Assyria. But I don't know at what point Nineveh became the capital in their history. But all this to validate your point that, yeah, there's a lot of space for when this story could have happened. And so it's part of the reason why I'm disinclined to speculate too much myself, but not that it's a wrong thing to do. Who knows? Maybe Jonah predated Abraham. You know, who knows? Any other comments on this, or should we explore this psychological approach? I mean, I'll be honest. I'm the most drawn to the approach that all of you have been naming as well. This kind of idea that that these imprecatory psalms and these curses are actually designed to be a way of working through feelings of pain. But I do think you have to be careful with that. But I read an interesting article from someone from Faith Mennonite Church, whom I'm guessing some of you know, but I don't, named Joetta Schleybaugh. Mm-hmm. And she quoted the author of the Believers Church commentary on Psalms, James Walter, but also intermingled some of her own commentary on it. And made these 3 observations about these. In particular, she was focusing on the imprecatory psalms, like the psalms that call for vengeance on enemies. And the first observation was kind of what you all have been saying, that these yearnings for vengeance are important because they're an honest reflection of what people feel. It's a natural response, and you have to name it in order to deal with it. So pretending that you don't have these kinds of feelings isn't helpful. This kind of gives you a chance to express it. I'd also say, you know, it's possible that you could say, well, what you're really experiencing is sadness, you know, get to the sadness behind it. But I don't know that it's really fair to ask victims to express their sadness in a way that puts them in a more vulnerable position, if that makes sense. Anger is a way of saying, like, you've really hurt me, and that's not okay. And I'm not, you know, I don't necessarily need to say, woe is me, and open myself up. I want to name that you have done something horribly, horribly wrong, and to emphasize that pain. So anyway, that's one point. I think another point that she'd make is that the speech about vengeance is not necessarily action about vengeance. Martha also kind of made this point. These texts never actually invite the people who say them to commit the acts of violence. They invite God to commit the acts of violence, but it isn't served as it's not a call of, let's go take vengeance on the Babylonians. It's a way of expressing it. And specifically, people observe that the vast majority, if not all, of these kinds of passages are written from a perspective of powerlessness, where the people wouldn't have been able to do this kind of thing anyway. Maybe powerlessness is too strong, but it's from the point of view of the oppressed. It's not people who are in the position of power who are saying, haha, let's take it. let's take vengeance on the people who are now under our foot. And then the last comment, which we already alluded to, is that all of these passages direct this anger to God. It's not, they're not saying it to their enemies. That might not be the case quite with the prophets as much as the imprecatory Psalms, but the idea that vengeance belongs to the Lord is kind of potentially a way of releasing it, right? Of saying, you do something, you do something with this, and maybe that could be seen as a type of therapeutic process. Now, I think it's legitimate to question that. I think that there are a number of psychologists who would say that dwelling on our desire for revenge doesn't actually help release it. It helps, it might make it worse. And I haven't done as much study on this, but one wonders whether people who read these kinds of passages can kind of feed on it, and it might inspire them to feel like they need to be the arm of God's anger and take out someone who's perceived as an oppressor. I don't know how often that happens, but I think those are ways to push back against this view. But I guess I'm interested in hearing what you think. Is this a valid way for those who have been severely traumatized by violence to cope and respond with it? Or is this something that even then we need to be careful about using?
I teach an anger class. Well, I've got, yeah, I taught an anger class for years. And some of the studies when I first started teaching that anger class did recommend beating a pillow, beating something up, thinking about that other person. But from the studies that have come recently, it's more, you can do that for a time, but it makes you more angry. Yeah. So you need to get some of that anger out, but you need to find ways of changing that anger and understanding it so that you can let that anger go. Mm. And most, at least in the anger classes, the cognitive behavior stuff that I've read and studied, most of the anger that we experience really is some anger at ourselves if we look deep enough. And it's a reflection on our own angst directed at somebody else. So if we kind of find those trigger points for the anger, we can slowly let go of some of that anger. And from my reading, that even goes as far as when we are abused. The other idea is that, no, we need to keep hold of that anger until we can let it go. Because if you truncate that anger too much, then it just goes inside and you get problems that come around and bite you. So yeah, we do need to hold on to that anger for a time, but then as we work with it slowly, that healing can happen. So that's two aspects there. One, we do need to hold on to the anger until we can kind of work through it and we can find some of that healing. And to find that healing, it's kind of going inside and resolving some of the anger that we have inside. Just some more psych stuff for everybody.
Yeah, that's interesting. Seems to kind of advocate both ways.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because if you give up your anger too soon, you lose out in that learning experience, because it just gets hidden inside and it just kind of comes out in other ways.
Well, that's kind of like what Wilma said in her sermon on forgiveness.
Yeah.
That, we shouldn't necessarily just rush to try to forgive, but to give it its due process.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is wisdom in that.
And the other thing is that forgiveness isn't forgetting. I constantly tell the guys I work with, when you learn or when you get to that point of forgiving, the healing happens when you can take that hurt and say, okay, now I can understand it and I can grow from it. And so you don't forget it. It becomes kind of a, well, as in, I guess, faith, the cornerstone that you grow from. And we can have a lot of cornerstones we grow from, but it's actually understanding that helps you move forward.
Thank you. Any others want to?
I guess maybe there's something safe about asking God to take those kind of actions. You can just say, just tear them up, and knowing that God's going to do the right thing, and you don't have to be responsible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Like, I wonder if even thinking about how we want to relate to parents at times, there's a desire sometimes for kids to just push against their parents and even have their parents not react or reward them in the way that they want, but they want to have the freedom to be the kid, the one who gets to express what they want so freely. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thought. Anyone else?
I think what I appreciated what you said, Herb, about how so much of the time the struggle with the anger is, well, a part of it is anger we feel towards ourselves. And sometimes that's because sometimes even the hardest thing that we can do is forgive ourselves. And that's all part of the process of forgiveness. And I think when we see passages like that in the Psalms, or even, in the prophets, or all those things that trouble us, it's a reminder to us that we ourselves, whether it's our ancestors back then or the Christian community now or whoever it is, but are likewise responsible to be perpetrators of the oppression that also is being, or some of the behaviors, like, if we're saying that this is speaking on behalf of of someone who is traumatized, likewise, it forces us to look at the things about ourselves or our own communities that need reevaluation. Instead of, kind of pulling the wool over our eyes and saying, we are the righteous people, the chosen people, because, we can see what happened to the chosen people. And so yeah, I guess that was kind of what I took from that, which is just, if we allow ourselves to read those scriptures or these, we see that it isn't all just, sweetness, light, goodness, it is looking at the ugly or dark side of ourselves, whether it was back then or now. I tend to read the Bible as something that is a document that is something we're reading as if it was for us today, even though, of course, you have to understand the context too. That gives it so much more richness, and it shows you all the parallels and how much history repeats itself. So, yeah.
So this is part of the challenge that Psalm 137 is written by a psalmist who, is presumably part of the deportation. And we are Assyria right now. The United States has done awful stuff to people in a number of different places around the world. And maybe we need to write Psalms from the perspective of the oppressor, asking for forgiveness and asking God to help us figure out how to find a better path, and not pretend to claim the position of those who are suffering and trying to figure out how to pray that, because we're not the ones in a global picture. We're not the ones who are suffering from being oppressed by others.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the important parts of the biblical story, is to be able to understand where you are and who you are in the story, right? I think we got in a lot of trouble when, for example, the people saw themselves as being the Israelites entering Canaan when they came to the United States, when in reality, they might have been a different figure in the biblical story. And yeah, I mean, that's a very helpful comment, Martha, is to remember that the United States, at least, is the world dominating empire. There's at least one of them right now. Yeah. I think that's a pretty great comment to end on, unless anybody has any burning questions or thoughts or hallelujahs or whatever. Does anybody want to offer anything else? Okay, well, thanks for doing this. It makes it a lot more meaningful for me to be able to read through the Bible when we can really wrestle through these hard parts together. And I appreciate you doing it, and your willingness to continue facing these hard questions.